All right. Hello, hello. Hopefully you can see my screen. Thank you for joining the Healing Illinois March program in honor of Women's History Month. My name is Dr. Hannah Maswani. I'm the Director of Mission and Equity Consulting at YWCA, and I'm thrilled to be able to talk about women. So let's do it. I always find, as I was doing the research for this and thinking about different trainings that I've done, different like books that I read, research that I do, all that sort of thing, it feels increasingly rare to have resources that are just for women. And I mean that intersectionally, because we're in sort of this place where women's rights are being attacked consistently, that we know this to be true, but we're also like, as far as humanity goes, we've progressed a decent amount in terms of our treatment for women. So it's kind of, I liken it to the way some folks after President Obama was elected in 2008, there was this kind of myth that we're post-racial. Not that we have a female president now, but I see a lot of um, discomfort in talking about women's rights in kind of the same way. Like we shouldn't be talking about women. There's more things to talk about, but that just leaves us embedded in the sexism that we all know and don't love. So I wanted to share a wee bit about Women's History Month as a concept. So I did not know that it has only been around since 1978 and began as a week. It was by the Education Task Force in Sonoma County. We at YWCA believe in education, departments and otherwise. They chose the week of March 8th to coincide with International Women's Day, which, fun fact, was officially declared for the first time by Vladimir Lenin in 1922. And I don't know about y'all, when I think feminism, Lenin isn't the first person to come to mind. Not the first thousand, but there it is. Shout out to Vlad. In 19, a sentence I'll never say again. In 1980, the group that is now known as the National Women's History Alliance lobbied Jimmy Carter to proclaim Women's History Week as nationally or federally recognized. And so that happened, but only 7 years after the fact, the president recognized it as a full month instead of just a week. A fact that I was honestly surprised about is that every president since 1995 has made a proclamation for Women's History Month. And that's something that is still going on now. And I'll talk a little bit about this year's proclamation. And we are in 2025. So if you're watching this in the future, do a little Google. You'll know what we're at. And the theme for this year's Women's History Month is moving forward together, women educating and inspiring generations. Again, we love education. So, is that what I was going to do? What was I going to do? We'll get there. The presidential proclamation is a spoiler to come. So, I wanted to take a moment to define woman. Part of the almost backlash against feminism, I would say, is because feminism has been misappropriated to keep trans women out of conversations and to invalidate trans women as women. So, for the purposes of my life, my worldview, this presentation, the YWCA's understanding as well of women, we include trans women in that as well. So, we're not making a differentiation between cis women and trans women. They're women. The only times that I'll make a differentiation is in terms of how, as a society and how politically we talk about both groups. And then any data that I share is disaggregated that way. But when I say woman, I mean all women. Anyone who identifies as a woman, you belong. So different movements of feminism, particularly second wave feminism, came up with this abomination in terms of centering the womb and centering the procreative abilities of women as core to the female experience. So, yes, being a mother, being able to give life is distinctly female, and it has been for a lot of time. However, we know that trans men may also give birth. But more the focus I want to make is language like this excludes the fact that not all women can give birth, not all women choose to give birth. And by the same way in which we talk about women in terms of wombs, we unknowingly alienate older women who may not be of child rearing age. And so there was this moment where feminism kind of got a little bit too gynecological, I would say. Not that I have any issues in terms of talking about bodies, but in terms of like limiting who got to claim womanhood. Again, with a recognition that being a cis woman is a different lived experience in many ways than being a trans woman. So In terms of trans women, about 1.6 million people in the US identify as transgender, or 0.6% of the population. So it's safe to kind of argue that about 0.3% of Americans identify as trans women, roughly there or thereabouts. A very, very small population, if you think about it statistically, in terms of how many millions of people live in the United States. However, in terms of particularly political discourse, whoo, I think we all know that more than 0.3% of headlines cover trans women in various not so lovely ways. And recently, this is March, what are we, March 27th of 2025. So again, for those watching later on, we are at a time when there has been a distinctly overwhelming amount of headlines, political opinions, social influencer type opinions about the dangers of transitioning, of invalidating trans identity, particularly trans female identity, with the myth that folks detransition all the time. That's not actually true. A number of studies done in the United Kingdom and the United States highlight that only between 2 and 4% of trans people detransition. So that means if I was born identified as female, I transition and outwardly represent my male truth. And then to detransition would mean that I would go back to identifying or showing myself as female. And the majority, so 62% of that 2 to 4%, mathematicians join me, only detransition temporarily and largely for issues like safety, a fear of prejudice, things like going to the doctor and not wanting that to be the central thing that's talked about. If you're going in for like pneumonia, your biological sex doesn't really matter in that case. And then also folks who detransition specifically around family members, so who will recloset and misgender themselves on purpose to feel that they can belong with family members. Because to be trans in the United States and most anywhere, many places in the world, I won't say most anywhere, to be trans is risking exclusion on a number of levels. So we know that 40% of the homeless youth population identify as LGBTQ, and we also know that about 41% of trans youth attempt suicide at some point in their lives. So the trans experience is a difficult one, not by nature of being trans in and of oneself, but because of societal responses to it. And so I wanted to give a moment to include trans women in terms of women, because there is this habit of using trans women as kind of a false flag. And so we know that a false flag is a military tactic used to kind of draw attention away from like where the attack is happening. So if I was going to be part of like the Moroccan army and I was going into Algeria, I would have an Algerian flag just so that they didn't suspect me coming. And if they saw me coming, they'd wonder what I was doing in a battle, as would I. So the false flag in terms of talking about women's rights and transgender rights is this villainization of trans women. So I mentioned earlier, and I was worried I lost this slide, but I didn't, our current president, who did a proclamation for Women's History Month each of the 5 years now that he has been president, has used transgender identity as a false flag, or rather has used the threat to cis women as a false flag to continue attacking transgender identity. I'll read one of the things in his very, very long proclamation. He stated that no longer will our government promote radical ideologies that replace women with men in spaces and opportunities designed for women, or devastate families by indoctrinating our sons and daughters to begin a war with their own bodies. I will safeguard the great American values of family, truth, well-being, and freedom. So all of these words in and of themselves sound pretty lovely. We don't want people to be at war with really anything. We want opportunities for women. We like the notions of family, truth, well-being, and freedom. But the first bit of his proclamation talks about how the government will no longer recognize trans identity in any capacity in terms of paperwork, will no longer allow folks to identify as X or a different gender than that which they were assigned at birth on any legal documentation. He describes trans identity in and of itself as something to be feared and antithetical to, again, the values of family, truth, well-being, and freedom. And we know that anti-trans rhetoric has used a lot of different things to villainize trans people, but it is particularly divisive and, in my humble opinion, insidious when we pit trans women against women and code them as entirely a threat. So in his remarks to support women, we're seeing that women are coded as at risk from other women. And for folks who identify as feminists but don't necessarily support or recognize trans female identity, there's a term called TERFs, TERFS, which is over here. I will share that this word TERF, and I'll stop using it from now, is considered a pejorative. So folks who do identify as feminists but don't support trans women don't like being called that. But the acronym stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. And so I'll give you a couple examples of that. And again, it's just folks whose views on gender identity are really biological and gynecological. And we see that pop culture figures and politicians alike are really leaning into kind of this trans exclusionary ideology. So throughout history, and I know that the movie Cruel Intentions doesn't count necessarily as all of American history, a classic though it was, real problematic as a rewatch. Don't recommend. Also, Death Becomes Her, fantastic movie at the time. Whew, does not hold up, but I welcome your thoughts on that too. So we know that throughout time, a classic tactic of misogyny is to pit women against each other. So we've seen this in the era of like Greek mythology, where Arachne, named for a spider, she was a phenomenal weaver. Athena got jealous, turned her into a spider. Hera, who was Zeus's wife, being mad at all the other women Zeus slept with instead of being mad at Zeus. And to like more modern examples like Bride Wars, Kate Hudson and Anne Hathaway, you could have just had a shared wedding. Ultimately, you do, but we have to sit through like 90 minutes of women fighting women in this sort of scarcity, zero sum mindset. The patriarchy has historically and presently shapes opportunities as limited for women, so that if there's 100% opportunity, women only get a lot less than 50% of that slice of pie, so to speak. And so the competition happens in group, woman versus woman, instead of a questioning, why do the men get more opportunities than us? Let's band together and sort of, retaliate against that or fight against that. It's something we see in a lot of minoritized identities, kind of this pitting against each other. We see it with racialized rhetoric, both the last election and for, every other election beforehand of, do you value Latino rights or Black rights more? Like, we can value all of them, but it is a cunning strategy from those in power to keep disenfranchised groups fighting against each other. In the case of female representation and women fighting women, this is far more blatant in terms of media representation. So consistently seeing examples throughout history of shamelessly just pitting women against each other. And we see it now in ways that are kind of difficult, I will be honest, to acknowledge. So here we have Jasmine Crockett, who is well, my bias is fantastic. And then we have Marjorie Taylor Greene here. So they are both on opposite ends of the political spectrum. There have been several viral moments where both of these politicians have verbally attacked each other for physical qualities. So Marjorie Taylor Greene commenting on Jasmine Crockett's eyelashes, Jasmine Crockett calling Marjorie Taylor Greene commenting on her body. I forget how to say it. It's a lot of alliteration. And it makes for really engaging and, I'll be honest, funny viral moments. Yet the way we respond to that is really different than when we see, for example, our president and vice president go for or disrespect the president of the Ukraine. We don't give it as much zing, as much zest, as much kind of like juiciness, because we're socialized to see men arguing as more valid, and then women arguing is like, oh, girls, just those women. And an unfortunate thing, especially in this example, which was first to come to mind, a lot of the comments women typically we see throw at each other go back to body image, go back to kind of beauty standards, go back to the idea that there is a right way to look. So Marjorie Taylor Greene saying your eyelashes are wrong, like your physicality is wrong, and then Jasmine Crockett responding in kind. There's also a recent trend for those of you who are on TikTok. I am not, but I have my curator, aka wife, tells me what's going on with the youth these days. The notion of Republican makeup. If anyone has seen this trend of attacking Republican women for not being able to properly apply eyeliner and foundation. Something that sounds ridiculous as I say it, because it is, but it is a very viral trend that is happening. And it's silly, it feels light, but it is representative of the way that women are socialized to feel insecure about our bodies, our looks, and that makes it kind of an easy spot to attack or go for first. And what I see happening, and to bring it back to women's history in terms of including all women, we're seeing this divide and conquer strategy by the consistent framing of cis women or cisgender women as separate from trans women. And so, in the same way that we have this scarcity mindset, the zero sum game of if Becky and I are together and there's only one position for a leadership role, I have to fight Becky for it, right? Like if she wins, I lose kind of thing. We're seeing, and she would win. We're seeing the same kind of thing of like if trans women get rights, that's going to disenfranchise cisgender women. Even in President Trump's remarks of saying like all these opportunities are for women, trans women who he identifies as men are stealing those spots. Very similar to rhetoric around like who is threatening American jobs, that sort of thing. Um, there are a number of examples of this rhetoric, even from the formerly loved J.K. Rowling, um, uh, what's his name, Joe Rogan, his myth that he admitted was a lie in terms of kitty litter in schools, this like ridiculousness that we bring. And this ridiculousness, I mean, kitty litter is next level bizarre, but we saw a lot of the same rhetoric. Maybe not we, I don't believe any of us were around in the 1920s, but with the suffragist movement, in terms of, oh, if we let women vote, like the men will never eat, that kind of thing of like, for like empowering women is antithetical to traditional family values, of course, being patriarchal and putting the masculine figure as the head of the household with that authority. I do want to share that there are plentiful myths about trans athletes. So there have been dozens, if not hundreds, of op-eds, policy changes, and live at 6 news specials in terms of the fear of trans women dominating the NCAA and not giving cis women a chance to compete in sports. We see, I believe, the Olympics recently. I think it was the Olympics. Fact check me on this, but requires gender proof testing, if you will. I imagine that involves ogling female athletes to be sure that they are women before they can compete. Gross. There were only, at the last count, there were only 4 trans athletes in the NCAA last year. So all of this hoopla, for lack of a better word, was about 4 people. And I don't necessarily know that all were trans women. And I was talking to my wife about this in terms of like, did you know they're not letting trans women compete and they're making them prove their gender? And she made a very, very good point of trans women take estrogen. Estrogen is not necessarily known for boosting muscle mass, right? It is a difficult physical process. And I see some smiles there on the screen. Trans men take testosterone. More testosterone means kind of more muscle. So not that I want to give anyone ideas, but if you were going to go for a trans identity that has an advantage, you're looking in the wrong place. Not that any does. All right, so I want to unpack some of the division that we see, whether it's between cis women and trans women or between just women in general. So again, we have this scarcity thinking of if we let the trans women compete, oh no, the cis women won't have as many opportunities, as opposed to having the idea that cis women, trans women can all succeed and it's still success for women. And in times of scarcity, women and immigrants are most likely to be blamed for what Americans view as our limited success, our success to which we are entitled. We see that with economic depressions in terms of like immigrants taking jobs. We know that's happened historically with things like the Bracero program, limiting immigration from East Asia after the railroads were built, that sort of thing. Even now, in terms of anti-immigrant rhetoric, after World War II, and women were integral to World War II to production and life in America and industry still running during World War II. But when the gents came back from the war, these women were told to leave their job because they were for the men. So there's this idea of there's not enough jobs for both of us. And it's the same symptom and the same fear and the same language we see throughout history and in new and weird creative ways to keep women down. One of the more salient examples for me, I heard this a lot going through my own undergraduate experience, was that, oh no, there's more women than boys on this campus. Who will we date? We have to fight all the other girls to date the boys. I was no one's competition, surprise. But this has been true since the 1970s. I see you, Kyle, where women represent an ever increasing percentage of college students. So since the late 1970s, there have been percentage-wise more women in colleges than men. And presently we're about 58% women, and then was that 42% men. There is this idea then that because we're so used to male dominated spaces in leadership, or because we think we should be striving for equal parity, when we start off with a greater percentage of women, there's this framing of, well, that means there's even less opportunity for us. It's not just 50-50, it's like 58% fighting for 50% of the opportunities kind of thing. And so we do this weird sexist math where we don't necessarily challenge patriarchal norms of why must at least half of leadership be male or most of leadership be male. We challenge each other as women. And so a lot of this does come from internalized sexism or the subconscious adoption of sexist beliefs. Culture is the soup we swim in, for lack of a less unpleasant phrase. And we do tend to absorb myths, ideologies, stereotypes, and anxieties from what society tells us to be anxious about. I love that when I ask folks who are Gen Z if they know what Cosmo magazine is, and they say no, because Cosmopolitan magazine in the early aughts to mid aughts was like this seminal text in terms of body image insecurities, how you're supposed to act around men. And it was very much like a prescriptive, this is how to be a successful, beautiful woman. And it leaned so heavily on appealing to the male gaze or appealing to traditional, pretty sexist notions of what a woman should look like, what a woman should do sexually, all that sort of thing. And we see a lot of these stereotypes come from women ourselves in sort of joking ways, like in sitcoms. Fun fact, talking Barbies, first words were "I hate math," leaning into the stereotype that STEM is for men. And then women victim blaming other women. We've seen this in very high profile Title IX cases where female politicians are asking survivors of assault, well, like, what were you wearing? What did you think? And there's actually quite an audience for that sort of thing because victim blaming allows the crimes to continue at the rate in which they do, and it reduces the blame on any male aggressor. And so there's a shocking number of books to that effect, which do not recommend. So why do we as women, or for those of us who are women, play into sexism? It's a little bit of a go along to get along. It's a little bit of because that's what we're used to. Some of it is cultural conditioning, as I mentioned. It's what we're exposed to, whether it's the 1950s good old days, I need to have a petticoat on, stand by the fridge, dinner, all three meals are ready at the right time. Whether it's things like Barbie hating math, typically male dominated leadership roles, teacher positions, that kind of thing. Or even in terms of teacher positions, most educators for toddlers and very young kids are female, versus when you get to college, it's majority male, giving more credibility to men, more nurturing skills for women. It's what we see, it's what we role model. Patriarchal reward system. So again, women who conform to norms receive validation. So it's easier in life to get ahead if you fit a stereotype or fit a norm or are pleasant and accepted. One of the examples I think of is AOC, who's phenomenal and like kind of the girl gang, who got a lot more recognition than other female politicians at the time, partly because they were fantastic, they were a crew, but they were all conventionally attractive women. And so there were so many interviews that AOC did whilst doing her makeup, while kind of focusing on that. And it's not a negative thing to be invested in your appearance by any means, but it is an interesting avenue by which female leadership kind of has to be coded to be palatable or to be discussed in ways that are seen as complementary and not like power grabs. Think of the ways in which the society talked about Hillary Clinton in terms of her suits, in terms of her voice being shrill, because she does not fit into that conventional model of like young, attractive women. They're rewarded or punished for that. And that's kind of the vessel or the vehicle by which we offer praise or condemnation. And then lastly, internalized sexism and kind of playing by patriarchal rules is a survival mechanism, particularly in male-run spaces. Still to this day, knowing high-level leadership at a couple of our local universities who still feel the obligation to make the cookies and muffins for the like birthday parties and doing it because it is coded as mean or bitchy not to do that, not just by men in the space, but by women in the space. So there's this expectation to be nurturing and a leader, but not too much of a leader because that's a male trait. And so kind of fitting in sometimes is just less work. And so we might do that. Which leads us to the glass ceiling. So most of you have probably heard of this phrase. It's this invisible barrier that prevents women from reaching leadership positions, whether it's career, even socially and politically, that kind of thing. It's not a formal rule, but it's this limitation that we put on ourselves and other people put on us too. There have been a couple of different studies that show women are less likely to apply to a job where they don't meet 100% of the qualifications versus a man who's more likely to apply to a job where he meets 70% of the qualifications. So you're seeing language in job applications that are like, we encourage you, even if, because we're trying to remove this glass ceiling, just because that's kind of our internalized monologue. Um, and again, the glass ceiling is something that women too uphold, people of all genders uphold. There's also a concept I very much enjoy of the, I don't enjoy, but I enjoy that it's named, of the glass cliff, where we only put women in leadership positions after an organization is already at threat of failure. So we see that with examples that come to mind, the folks who developed or named the concept of glass ceiling were in higher education. The notion that superintendents or presidents of schools would be women only after the school was rated really poorly, had poor morale, had poor grades. So like, okay, these guys couldn't do it, might as well let a woman try. And it's this almost setting up for failure or giving her a job that is twice as hard as it might be for a man. And an example of the glass cliff, I would argue, would be the Democratic nomination for Kamala Harris in terms of knowing that Biden was being poorly received, knowing that Trump was the opponent. It's far more of a weighty task than that which previous elections might have been in which women weren't chosen. So we can talk about that a little bit later after we stop recording. So how do we spot glass ceilings? It's historical exclusion from power. And this is where it gets really messy. So when we talk about, again, intersections of being a woman and being of all different identities, the conversation can become very white focused because, again, we absorb what is around us, and that's a lot of the representation we see, but it's important to know that that's lived differently. So there's this concept called oppression by seduction that was very, very obvious in the time of slavery. So if we think about the standard horrible plantations, there were slave owners, typically men, there were their wives, typically women. Women could not own property, men could own people. And we see very Miss Anne egregious behavior from white women who would abuse their enslaved folks because it was what the man would want them to do and because it was an outlet for any sexism they were experiencing from the man. And so a lot of Black men lost their lives both during the time of slavery and well afterwards. I'm thinking of Emmett Till. I'm thinking of the I forgot the name, the five who were wrongly accused of raping a white woman. The white woman admitted that she lied. Um, because we pit white femininity as something that we put on a pedestal. We coo, we like protect it. We oppress it, again, by seduction, by validating it. And then there's oppression by exclusion, which is the opposite, where we oppress Black women. We think of stereotypes like the Jezebel, the Mammy. We exclude them, we denigrate them, we don't value them. Versus oppression by seduction, we do value the white woman. We want to protect her, but we're still limiting her agency. And unfortunately, we can get into a very unproductive game of oppression Olympics in terms of who has it worse, oppression by seduction, oppression by exclusion. But again, what that does is stop us from talking about who is doing the oppression. A second way to spot a glass ceiling is problematic representation. So we aren't post-feminist in any way, shape, or form. I was going to talk about Andrew Tate a little bit more, but I don't want to give him airtime. Please, no, no, thank you, sir. But if we think about the ways in which women are talked about in the deep, dark corners of the internet, but also in terms of very problematic fashion ads or alcohol ads or different things that show women in very like pejorative ways or subjugated ways. And then we see that trans women have limited representation. I want to give out a shout out to Sarah McBride, who I met in 2006 on a church trip before her transition. I was like, is it? So fantastic, wonderful politician, but she can't get her job done because she, as well as she would, because she's fending off people misgendering her for fun or to be abusive. And so it becomes this limitation of what she can do because she's so busy fighting off the noise to get to her real job where she could be very excellent. And then glass ceilings, flat out, we don't value women's voices as a society in the same way. There have been various studies. My favorite was in film analysis of talking parts in movies, whether it was men who spoke or women who spoke. And this is a very like binary example of research because it was done, I believe, in the late 90s. Studies showed that if in mixed gender spaces, so like our little discussion later, if women talk between 25 to 30% of the time, it's perceived as equality. If women talk more than 30% of the time, or even up to half of the time, it's perceived as a female dominated conversation because of societally how used to hearing men's voices we are, how used to in like a film sense, but also in like a political sense, we're used to men's voices carrying authority. That's why, for example, movies that have female leads often struggle a little bit more in the box office than movies with male leads because we have this ability to see ourselves or in like protagonists who are male because that's the everyman experience, but women are kind of coded as a little bit less than, and then speaking too much if it's equal. In terms of speaking, which I'm doing a lot of right now, I wanted to give a little shout out to the concept of gossip. I don't know if anyone in this space has been called a gossip or being told they gossip or has, you know, scolded someone for gossiping. So there's this phrase that Eleanor Roosevelt allegedly said, couldn't find 100% proof, but she allegedly said that great minds talk about ideas, average minds talk about events, small minds discuss people. There is a linguist called Amanda Montell, and then a researcher of gossip named Kelsey McKinney, who both identified this kind of informal norm that as a society we say men talk about ideas, women talk about people. And no, not really true, because have you heard of football stats? And like the fellas who can just repeat all of that, pretty sure it's people playing football. And so we just have this innate way that we are witness to gossip more in women than we are in men, even though numerous studies, including meta studies, have shown that women and men gossip at similar rates. There's also a putting down women's conversations as just gossip rids them of any importance, and at times it can be really important. So, as Kelsey McKinney says, gossip is a survival mechanism. So, it's everything from telling your friend that the guy you just went out with is creepy, the guy she matched with on Hinge, like, is a bit suspicious, talking about like your boss being maybe someone who's dangerous to be around. And gossip is just sharing of information, and the ways in which we denigrate it for women don't make sense logically because it's a lot of the same things that women share that men share. Like, this is where the good food is at. This is somebody that you can trust. This is somebody that you can't trust. But we code it again far more maliciously or as less or trivial, frivolous, if you will. I nearly said trivial for women. I also wanted to talk a little bit about age, and then we're very close to wrapping up here. Um, Several folks have said the line that there is no group more vilified than teenage girls. And I don't know that I fully agree with that in terms of vilification, but there is a lot of cultural sass that teen girls get. So if you think about the hate that Taylor Swift seems to get, the laughter that we throw at Twilight, and like the stereotypical Valley Girl accent, I will admit most of those jokes I have also made myself are uniquely denigrating young women and treating women as sort of like ditzy, not bright enough as men. Like, we don't necessarily talk about bands that men like more. I don't know music that well. Fish, maybe. We don't denigrate Fish. That's a band, right? Dave Matthews Band. I see y'all shaking your heads at me. It's fine. Pretend I'm cool and I insert cultural reference here. But when we think about young women, particularly young women of color, they're actually cultural leaders. They generate the most slang that is then adopted into everyday speak. So things like even the word cool, that came out of young Black female slang. Other words that I won't use today, but other more common slang words that are coming into popularity today are also from younger teen girls. But they're the group that we copy the most in terms of linguistic evolution, in terms of cultural change, but it's also the group we mock the most. Remember listening to radio stations where it was kind of a boy band. One Direction was playing, and the radio DJ was like, "Oh, we got to stop letting girls under 15 buy music because it's ruining it for the rest of us," was a thing he said. And that's like stuck with me because why is a little girl's opinion less valid than your old man opinion? Like, it's just not. And then when it comes to the ways girls treat each other and boys also treat girls, it holds true online in terms of teen girls experiencing a whole lot more bullying and a whole lot more multiple instances of bullying. So you can see across a woman's lifespan the absorption of all that anti-woman hate of being told you're frivolous, you have no taste, you're not smart enough, you don't look the right way. That's what causes us to grow up into women who do make the kind of jokes about Twilight that I confess that I have made. And sure, there are ways to say, well, I didn't mean it to be sexist, but it's just a curious thought that I sit with and unpack in terms of why did I do it about that and not about Dune? Didn't read either book, but they're both pretty gendered. So why is one more rife for ridicule than the other? And I will say, I know that Twilight's not well written per se, and I don't know if Dune is, but there's just that ease with which we make sexism a part of our jokes or in which sexism guides our jokes. And I wanted to fess up to it as well. So what do we do to weaken the glass ceiling? And we have to talk about gender, particularly bathrooms. I will always talk about bathrooms because even when we are creating gender neutral or gender expansive bathrooms, there was a study that showed that it's typically, statistically, the women's bathroom that is changed into all gender instead of the men's bathroom that is changed into all gender. There's no evidence as to why that is, but again, it's robbing women of a women only space. I include trans women in that. And that's problematic because women own less than to around 10% of all ownable property in the world, in the entire planet. And so there's very few spaces that are just for women. Thinking about my home country of Morocco, there aren't public bathrooms. And now that I think about it, there really aren't that many just public bathrooms at all in Bloomington normal, unless you go into a shop. So as a woman, if you're going out and about, you may need the bathroom more, slash not be able to go to the bathroom in a capacity in which Kyle Nowers will arrest you for. So it's less welcoming for women to be out and about. And that stems from the idea that women didn't need to be out and about when trade was predominantly run by men. We have to talk about money. Typically, overall, women earn 79% of the average man's salary. That drops to 62% for Latino women in terms of comparable men's salaries. But women's products cost up to 42% more than men's products if we think about the pink tax. So I can buy a pink plastic razor for almost 40% more money than a fella can buy a better functioning blue razor. And then we have to talk about bodily needs. There is intense shame still in a lot of the world, and I include America in this, to talk about things like periods, to talk about things like genital health. STDs are often attributed to the women who are engaged in the act versus the men who are engaged in the act because we're so used to shaming women's bodies. And so we have to talk about that, right? We have to normalize cramps because most people get them, or many people get them, I should say. And we have to do so in a way that doesn't value one body over another, but tries to see bodies as neutral because we're in a society where female bodies are objectified, demonized, pauper in the red tent, that kind of thing, whereas men's bodies are seen as the neutral. Okay. So what can we do in terms of honoring women, women's history, and challenging some of that internal sexism? So I will offer these up for folks to reflect on at home. And then with the 15 minutes we have left for the group that is attending here, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. Things we can do is to develop a self-awareness. So like calling myself out on some of the jokes that I have made in the past, right? Know where my own sort of weak spots lie, where I might have absorbed some internalized sexism or internalized misogyny. So I encourage you to reflect on what adjectives might you use to describe a female friend versus a male friend, or a female frenemy versus a male frenemy, or politician perhaps. So like think on that. Advocate for yourself. If you're a woman, ask for promotions, opportunities, negotiate. This is something that I'm personally not very good at. I'm great at telling people to do it, but it still feels physically uncomfortable. So trying to work on that, trying to give yourself as much agency. And one piece of advice that I like to give any of the younger folks that I have the privilege of mentoring, is change your inner critic's voice, the voice of someone you don't like. So whether it's a politician or an old school bully, when you have that voice that says, you're not good enough, don't even try, separate it from you, because that is the combination of sexist opinions that you've observed. You're absorbing other people's opinions about women and repeating them to yourself as though they're your own. So I pick someone I don't necessarily like and kind of like make fun of myself a little bit of like, you'll never make it. Why would I listen to somebody like that? Let me try it anyway, instead of me believing that I am telling myself I can't make it. And then to build relationships, to connect with people who get it. So people who are feminist, who do advocate for trans inclusive feminism, but then also connect with people who don't, particularly if you are not a woman, challenging sexism when it comes up. We're in an era where our president has literally been accused of sexual assault. We all know about the Access Hollywood tape where deep, deep levels of problematic sexism aren't an issue. So we have to normalize challenging sexism. And that doesn't necessarily mean we all need to march on Washington, but we do need to have conversations that interrupt sexism wherever we can. And so a thing that I encourage y'all to do and hopefully share to the degree you're comfortable is, was there a time that you voiced a sexist or cis sexist thought? Cis sexist meaning trans exclusive. And how do you wish someone had responded to you? So how can you respond to the next person who does the same thing? All right, yeah. Is that the last slide? Maybe not. Yep. Okay. So this is those were some things to kind of ponder. And then as you move forward throughout the rest of Women's History Month and the rest of time in general, think of ways that we can challenge the idea that trans women are a threat to women. Again, the bathroom argument is weak. It's not anything that's rooted in reality. How do we combat that? How do we combat the recent influx of sexist policies? There is a deep problem about men who are quote unquote red pilled in terms of seeing women as the enemy. So the incel kind of group that we can talk about at the degree to which you want. And then how can we use our own respective spheres of influence to negate the idea that sexism isn't as big a deal anymore, or that when we talk about feminism, it's only white people that we center. So how do we not play that game, and how do we take the conversation a little bit further? So with that, I will stop recording. Thank you for tuning in and hopefully not tuning out. And let's chat.